Today we have Kristi Vera. She received her Master's of Social Work from the Virginia Commonwealth University in 1997. She went on to complete her internship and currently works as a staff clinician and coordinator for groups at the Virginia Commonwealth University. Kristi's theoretical orientation is founded on object relations and attachment theory, two theories I'm very interested in, and she'll explain to us here in a moment. Her clinical interests include trauma, working with cluster B personality disorders, group therapy, grief, and multicultural issues. Kristi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I've kind of started some of these episodes with I think there are so many different paths that lead to working in this field, and I would kind of like to hear your story on what got you interested and how you wound up working in psychology clinical work.
Yeah, I used to teach, and I really liked teaching, but after a while, really I thought, okay, this is crushing my spirit, right? And so I said, I need to do something different. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, but I actually went to career counseling, and the woman, when she first met with me, said, have you ever thought of being a therapist? And I originally said, oh, no, I could never do that, because when my friends are sad, I'm really sad, and when they're happy, I'm happy, which actually is empathy, right? But at the time, I didn't know that, right? And so she said, well, let's consider it. And so she did a whole bunch of assessments, and they all came down to, I probably should explore being a therapist. And then around the same time, I had the parent of, I taught several of her children, had called me about something. And I said, well, actually, I'm not sure I'm returning to teach next year. And she said, oh, are you going to be a therapist? And I said, well, actually, this is what this, career counselor said. And she goes, oh, I've always thought of you as a therapist. And then I actually had two other incidents where some folk I knew in Europe from some work I had done over there called me and were like, hey, what are you up to? I said, oh, I'm thinking about changing careers. And they said, oh, are you going to be a therapist? I mean, I literally had the same experience 3 times. And so I was like, all right, I get the message. Like, yeah, so the whole world except for me knew that perhaps I should be a therapist. And so, so I explored different avenues to reach that goal, and already have another graduate degree. And so I chose 3 possible paths. And so I applied for a PhD program, which I got into. I applied for a pastoral care program, which I got to the interviewing portion of, and then I got into a social work program. And really at the beginning, social work provided the quickest avenue to get to the goal. So that's kind of how I originally chose that path. I'm really glad I did, though, because it speaks to kind of more of the external factors that contribute to people's stress, right? And that not all stressors are purely in our minds. And so kind of, I like the broader perspective in terms of looking at what adds to people's distress or contributes to people getting stuck. And then also kind of helps us look at what are the systems and environmental factors that we need to attend to that perhaps we can also help change that will improve folks' mental health. So that's really how I got there. But everybody but me knew that I probably should explore it. And I'm thankful that they did. And I'm thankful that I did, because now I've been doing this work for, I think, 24 years now. So, yeah.
And you're loving it?
I do. I love the work with clients. And when I'm in the room with clients, I just enjoy that. And really, it's kind of it's a sacred trust and honor, right? That why in the world should someone let anybody into their life and share their most vulnerable aspects or the most painful aspects or the parts of themselves that they're not proud of, right? With someone. And so to walk those paths with them, I really do enjoy. If you ask my boss or other people at my agency, they tell you all the other stuff, like the politics and the meetings and stuff. I'm not so much into that stuff. I go and I participate, but the work with clients is what I really love and enjoy. So
yeah. I think have you heard of Nancy McWilliams? In one of her books, she talked about just the work as a therapist and having different people from all walks of life open up to you and tell you their deepest, darkest secrets, and you get to hear all of these different stories and how it is very much a privilege, and I really resonate with that.
Yeah, I think we can, I think therapists can probably take, probably multiple approaches, but I think sometimes, thinking that, oh yeah, we know everything or we have all the answers, not so much, right? But but if you think about it, like she said, and like you're talking about, Daniel, it's just to say, wow, what a humbling experience that someone trusts me to stand with them in this, really takes a lot of courage, so I think when we take a step back from it and look and say, gosh, what are people really doing when they entrust us with their care? I don't know how you can be anything but humble about it. So
yeah. And I'm not too sure about what all social work or what a degree in like a master's in social work entails. When I was looking into schooling, it was like, either a master's in clinical counseling or a PsyD or something like that. So can you explain the path through social work?
yeah, and so a master's in social work is a terminal degree for clinical work. So if someone were to get their PhD in social work, that would basically open the door for them to teach at a university. Like I said, I came out of teaching, not at a university. I taught in a high school, but I'd already taught. And so, I actually teach a group psychotherapy class now, which is fun with clinical and counseling psych PhD students, but I really wasn't getting another degree to continue to teach. And so going through social work, I think the main difference is, social workers can do all kinds of things, which I actually like. So I thought, well, if I ever get bored, I can go do something else and not have to get another degree to do it. And actually my first year, I focused in my internships around child protective service work and really enjoyed that as well. Got really involved in like research around kinship care and some things like that, thinking about, what are systems that can help children when we remove them from, hurtful situations. So, and also those seeing the impact and really like, how can we help families and keep families together? Because most of the time when we had to remove children didn't want to leave. They just wanted abuse to stop, right? So, so think about those things. So the first part is it's a broader perspective, which then, but you can focus on different avenues. And so for me, I focused on the clinical avenue. So my second year, all my hours were at the counseling center where I currently work, right? And so seeing clients there. So that was the path I took. Other people can take a macro approach and a macro path. And so they're going to work in government systems and looking at policy changes and stuff like that, trying to change the system from the structural pieces of it, right? Although people are always parts of systems. So if you change people, you're going to contribute to changing systems. It's just a slower process. But for me, it was the avenue that I really liked. But from that, you can go clinical in a lot of different ways. So some people are going to go work primarily with substance abuse. Some folks are going to focus on children, like that. For me, like I said, my first year I focused on child protective service. So I worked a lot with children. And then in this case, I worked at a college counseling center and really liked the work there. And then college counseling centers also have some elements of teaching through outreach and things like that. So I could keep some of my former skills, but then focus on the clinical work. So, a lot of social workers, LCSWs, will go into private practice. There may be that part in my life, in the years to come. But I kind of struggled with just the social work values about helping people gain access to services they need, right? But also that conflict of you got to make money, you got to make a living. So I appreciate the people that are in private practice and the fees they have to charge, but just trying to balance out. So this really is the best, for me, currently the best balance of all those things.
And how is it that working in the University Counseling Center aligns with the values of what you were just talking to?
Yeah, well, we have a policy. We've tried to design access to our services in a way that take into consideration social justice issues. So I think it's true across the board that the need for mental health services outweighs the number of staff and resources and faculty. And that's true not only in college counseling centers, but anywhere, right? I think right now in the country. And so for us, it's really looking at what resources does a student already come with? So for example, if they have good insurance, right? And so we might talk to them about, based on what you've come to talk to us about and the help you're seeking, you've got great insurance. So let me help you get connected with a provider out in the community, right? And so doing that for them versus like a student who comes in and has no resources, right? First gen, no insurance, or, lives below the poverty line, really, quite frankly. So saying, okay, we can provide some services to you now. We might not be able to provide longer term treatment to you, but at least to get you some help that you need. And I heard Scott Miller in a workshop a couple weeks go and say, the average number of sessions, and it's been this way forever, is 5 to 6, regardless of where people seek treatment. And so that's true in college counseling centers. The average number of sessions for individual therapy is 5 to 6. Most of my clients don't reach. We're not in that number. It's beyond that. So, so I appreciate all the other people that keep the numbers down. But kind of thinking about what resources are available, what resources do students have. Based on that, how do we kind of select in such a way that we help people get connected to those outside resources if they have the means to do so, and if they don't, what are the services we can provide for them in-house, so that they at least get some support right now. So
yeah, so it sounds very brief and solutions focused.
What we tell students is we follow a brief model that the average number of sessions is 5 to 6, and that's true when you run the data. I think people work from all varying theoretical orientations within that. And so some people might be more solution focused, but other people are going to say, okay, if we can do a brief piece of work around part of your presenting concern. And this is true of trauma work, right? Like the cool thing about trauma research is we don't need to work through all your trauma, right? But we need to work on the pieces of your trauma that impact you today and hold you back. And if we can kind of bring healing in those spaces, in some ways, either the rest of it, it doesn't impact you and you're free from it. And not to say, we can never erase your history, but it becomes kind of like you have a nice bookshelf behind you, like comes one of the books on the shelf versus like your whole back screen, so to speak. Right. And so, so I think we probably have some clinicians who work from a solution focused orientation, but that we have a lot of folk who are working from a variety of ones. So, but it's also, you need to be better at what it does mean is I think you need to be focused on, okay, what's the issue at hand and really clear about that. You don't have the luxury of kind of a more free flowing session sometimes with folks, and so keeping the goal in mind. But like I said, I've been there for 24 years and I have a great boss and he just trusts me to do what I think is best. And so that's what I do. And so I have had clients who I appreciate my clients who come for 3 sessions and are like, I think I got what I need. I'm like, great. But I also have people that I've worked with for quite some time now. So, and then our groups, our interpersonal process therapy groups, students can be in those for as long as they're students. So some people have been with me for a couple of years, and then some people have been with me a couple of weeks. So.
Oh, so, okay. So that's interesting. So, I'm currently in a group class with Dr. Stevens, and this was our first semester of doing it. It's we learned a little bit about processing groups and then skills-based groups, and processing groups, the way I've imagined it so far, I haven't worked in any. The way I've imagined it is, maybe you have a processing or like a grief group or a trauma group, and then you do different rotations, like maybe one lasts for 2 months and then you start a new group or something. So can you tell us about the groups that you run, and is there is there a specific focus, or is it just anyone who wants to show up, and how does that play out?
They're open-ended groups in terms of people come and go at various times during the semester, right, or the year. And so they're not theme groups because we don't believe people are their problem. We believe people have problems. We do have some theme groups. So for example, we have a group that's called Reclaim, and it's a 6-week mindfulness-based skills group for folks with anxiety, right? And kind of what we found is that if folks come to 5 or 6 of the sessions, they get better. If they come to fewer than 5, it's a wash and not really helpful. So we try to explain that to people when we're making the referral. But it is mindfulness-based skills, right? And it is a sole focus on anxiety. And then we have some kind of identity groups, right? Which we run typically outside of the agency, like through our Office of Multicultural Student Affairs and things like that, right? And then we have another group that we've run with the help of the Office of Students with Disabilities, which has been really popular and successful, which is one for students with chronic illness, which the pandemic kind of brought that to the forefront. But it's been filled from the get-go, and there's a wait list for folks to get in, and and for some people it's their own illness, for some people it's their partner has a chronic illness that's impacting their functioning. So we do have some theme groups. They're just not our interpersonal process therapy groups. And our interpersonal process therapy groups, they're not theme based. And so, like I said, but the really cool thing and the thing that's therapeutic is that people often find other people have had their experience. And so how neat, because they're with people that they never would have joined with outside of group, and yet suddenly, and they're sharing someone else we work with the therapeutic factors, right? And so universality. So maybe somebody else shares about a shame-based experience that they had, and then that kind of grants somebody else permission to have the courage to say, gosh, I've had a similar experience, or I've had this experience where I felt ashamed, and this is what happened, right? And so Rutan, Stone, and Shea talk about group being a hall of mirrors. And so in some ways, getting that reflected, pieces of themselves reflected in each person and the feedback that they get there, I found it to be really powerful for folk. And it's interesting to see their goals change as they stay in group, right? So sometimes they're going to come and maybe they're socially anxious. That's why they're there. Other folk, they're, my romantic relationships aren't good and I can't figure out why, or other people are having family conflicts. So we try to listen to during the intake process about, okay, what's the interpersonal nature of this client's problem, right? Because I talk to people about how an interpersonal process therapy group can help address that, right? And if you think about interpersonal theory itself was created to address depression in the first place, right? And so in some ways, college counseling centers see a lot of depression and anxiety. And so kind of working with this thing and even really helping to teach folks empathy, right? Because they're more worried, I got to say the right thing, or I got to, whatever. And we're like, presence, PRESENCE is therapeutic, right? And not sure there is a right thing, but there's a showing up and caring about somebody thing, right? That's really helpful to folk. And so kind of seeing the growth in that. And I will say this too, that the pandemic has made people really hungry for groups, right? Like we have a pretty successful group program, but people were like, I need to be in a group. And now our groups are like, when are we coming back in person? And, we've been discussing that as well. So yeah, so for us, it's open-ended, but we do ask for a minimum of an 8-week commitment to start, just because we feel like it gives people a chance to kind of get in there, kind of get to know the other people, kind of find their place, and then make a good faith effort at their work. And after 8 weeks, if they want to leave, great. Or although I will say that for most folk who come for 8 weeks, they tend to stay either at least for a semester, right? So 13 weeks, or like I said, longer term. So yeah.
Good. Is this group open to people outside of the university?
Yeah, no, they're all college students. That's a good question though. Yeah. Which is kind of heartbreaking. People find I don't know how, people Google search for help. And I had a phone call the other day. I just happened to be the crisis on call person at work during that time slot who was not a student and was really in distress, and so just trying to then, and this is what social workers do, right? To also is find resources. So I tried to facilitate helping to find some resources for this person out in the community, but I was like, yeah, I'm sorry. We're not the people who can help you, but let me help you find people who that is their, role and would be happy to help. So,
what got you interested in group work?
Yeah, I wasn't interested at all, really. I was like, why in the world would anybody want to come? Why would anybody want to go to therapy and do group work when you can do individual therapy? I mean, I really did think that. And like I said, just happened to be this agency, and the guy who was our director at the time was the co-founder of Division 49 in APA, which is the group division. And so, as part of my training, I had to, and I'll use the word had to, serve as a process observer. Because really, if I'd had a choice, I don't think I would have. And the very first night was a really, really powerful session around grief. And you don't really know me, but I'm not much of a boo-hooer just in general. Doesn't mean that I don't cry or that I don't feel sad or have strong feelings, but it just means like, most of the time I'm like, okay. And I had to grit my teeth that night. I was like, oh my gosh, and I don't think it was group contagion. I think it was more just the power of group. And it really, so serving as the process observer really kind of changed my thoughts about this, and so, and now I'm our group coordinator. And when I go do workshops, I tell people, I said, I'm a convert, and those are the most zealous of folk, right? And so, and unabashedly and unapologetically so. And so now, and we talk in our agency about, group is an equal treatment modality to individual therapy, and all the literature suggests this. There hasn't been any literature that I know of that says, no, it's really not true. It's kind of across the board. And so knowing that and knowing that it can be helpful for folk, we really try to come with the mindset of why not group versus why group, right?
Yeah,
so.
Good. In our class, though, there was a paper on kind of the myths of group, and one of them was talking about, one is just that group is kind of like a finishing skills. So after individual therapy, or group is for when your wait list is so long in individual therapy, you don't know what else to do with everyone. Stuff like that. Yeah. So
Yeah. Yeah. And really probably a part of the work we've had to do is educate others. So for example, like psychiatrists who perhaps who work now at the university, but came from a hospital setting where they did just put people in groups kind of willy-nilly, right, would be really reticent when they talk to students who were like, oh, I'm in group, but the more they've gotten to know our groups, and then some of them have been places where they were really effective groups. Now they've started to refer people, say you need to go and be in group, right? Which is really cool, right?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of this wraparound service model where we're all giving the same message about this is what's going to be helpful to you, and this is why. As long as we can explain in interpersonal terms to a student, why. How and why this is the most helpful. And, they can still, we don't do mandated treatment, which is also a luxury, right? So if they say, I don't want to be in group, then okay, fine. This is what we can offer you, and, when you get to the end of that, if you want a referral out in the community, we can do that. Or if you want to join group, you can join group, so, yeah.
What would be how would your recommendation go if I was someone that you wanted to recommend group to?
I'd say, I'd probably be like, hey, Daniel, thanks so much. I said, I want to talk a little bit about what I think would be helpful and why. And so then I'd say, based on whatever your presenting concern was, I'd say, I think the group would be helpful. And then I would speak to the interpersonal nature of your concern, right? Or perhaps what the research suggests, right? And I would talk, I think it was Sullivan who said, I wouldn't say that part, but that is where it's coming from. Like Sullivan said, something like we're hurt in relationship and we're healed in relationship, right? And so while you could get something from this process between the two of us, what I want to do is give you an opportunity to be in a space with other people who are also working on things. And then I would name like the various things that people are working on, and I would always name the thing that the student came with, because quite frankly, I've always had that in my group. And we've even talked about fetishes in the groups. I'm trying to think of something that would be broad on the spectrum that you don't see much of. Yeah. Right. That it would be a lie for me to name, but I name it. And then try to explain how that's going to be helpful. If they're anxious, Sherry Marmarash and some other folk wrote a book about attachment in group, right? And so they talk about typically the folk who drop out of group early or who terminate early are people typically with like anxious attachment. And they do a great job of talking about, trying to address anxious attachment before you ever get people in group, to kind of normalize it, to name it, to say, this is probably going to happen. So if that were you, I would also say, now I know that you're anxious. And so I just want to name that at the beginning, this will probably really be heightened, but hopefully knowing that it will be, you can say, this is what Kristi told me about, and then these are the things that we can do to kind of help you, or ways to hang in there until you kind of work through that. And I tell my clients anyway, the ones with anxiety, I said, here's the bad news. The way to get over anxiety is to move through anxiety, right? So we're going to have to move through this in order to get better, And so I would do something like that. So couching your concerns in an interpersonal frame, and then talking to you specifically about how group addresses that, and then trying to assess where your pause buttons or fear buttons might be, and to begin to speak to those and normalize those, and then to talk about, moving through things to get to the place where you do the rest of the work. So
that's really good. Do you know if you think of the title of that book, I would be interested.
Yeah, I think it's actually called Attachment and Group Therapy. It's Sherry Marmarash, Raina Markham, who actually was an intern at our agency a long time ago and really loved group and attachment theory. And then Raina's husband, and his name leaves me now. So, but it's the three of them. Yeah, but I believe it's called Attachment and Group Psychotherapy. It's a great book, and it's a really easy read. So.
Speaking of attachment, I saw that you go by attachment theory and object relations theory. Yeah. Can you explain both of those theories to us, and maybe, why you got into those theories, or why those theories stand out to you?
Yeah. And I will say that probably my theoretical orientation is always evolving, right? And so, and I think that's true for anybody, right? Or hopefully true for most of us. But so like I said, I came from teaching, and teaching really follows a CBT framework, right? Okay. Most of the time. And so at the end of when I taught, students would say something, I'd say, well, here's how I'm going to answer. And then here's what you're going to say. And I'm going to say this, and you're going to say this. I'm going to say this. And I would go through a process. I said, and at the end, I'm going to say this, and this is what we're going to have to do. So would you like to have this conversation? And they're like, I don't want to have this conversation. I said, me either. So how about if we just go with this, right? So I will say, there's a place for CBT work. And for me, the longer I've been in the business, the more I think of all of them as like entry points, like where will the client let me into their world, right? And this is also a way I kind of try to think about how do I work with defenses, right? And so for some folk, they're going to let me into their world through kind of this cognitive frame or behavioral frame like that. And that's fine. But also then sometimes that also speaks to where they defended and where they're not letting you into their world. And so kind of knowing for me, like whichever door you let me through, I'm still going to try to enter the other rooms of the house, right? If I feel like it's necessary to do the work. So the thing, so I came out of teaching with this kind of CBT frame, which it's not exactly called that when you teach, but it is a lot of that, right? And so, so when I started to work with people, part of what I did when I first started is like, what do I believe about people? What do I believe about how people get stuck or how problems develop? What do I believe about what promotes healing for folk, right? Because all of it's theoretical, right? And none of it's written in stone. We can't cut people up and see internalized object representations of stuff, right? But when you look at the thing that I appreciate about object relations is that it says we all develop these what it calls internalized object representations, both of ourself and of others, which really are created kind of developmentally as we come into the world, right? So if I'm an infant and I sense this thing, which I say it as sensing just because sensory motor is slightly different from object relations, which I've incorporated in, but I sense this thing, I experience this thing, it's uncomfortable, I cry, somebody responds, right? They put this thing in my mouth, it tastes good, I eat, that thing goes. Well, I've learned something about myself and the other, right? And I've learned a very different thing from perhaps an infant who had the similar initial experience that I had, but got nothing back. So for example, I had a client once who had a single parent and the parent had mental illness. And this client showed me a picture once and they were an infant and they were propped up on pillows on a couch and they had a bottle actually propped in their mouth, but there's no other human being in the picture, right? And so, and their story was that as they kind of grew up, when they were little, they would have to call Child Protective Services on their sole parent just because when the parent would have psychotic breaks and there was no one else there. And so kind of the shame of that, but also, right, the dysregulation, right? If we're all neuro, bio, psycho, spiritual regulators of one another, right? And the thing that reflects back to me is dysregulated. How in the world do I learn how to regulate myself, right? So of course, folks are going to come with that. And so, so I believe that, right, about folk, that we start to internalize those things and then we start to see the world as those things. And that the cool thing about object relations is that we have these things called holding environments. Well, our families are the first one, but that there are outer rings of holding environments as well, right? And so okay, if this is what our immediate family group is, what's the holding environment of our extended family, right? What's the holding environment of our kind of cohort or our community? And what's the holding environment of the greater, world or that we're in, right? So if we think about most recently with kind of the social unrest and racial justice issues, right? So a person of color could come from a family that's really supportive, right? So the immediate holding environment and the things that they know about themselves, they got reflected back, may be positive and supportive, but yet when they start to go to those outer rings, it's a different message, right? And so having to say, gosh, how do I hold that sense of myself that's more positive and more holistic and hopefully more accurate, right, than the message I'm getting from out? And how can you not experience stress when suddenly you're like, whoa, because then it's like, what do I know to be true, or accurate about me? And so to give you another example, and I give this one to my clients, because I talk about this, like, sense of self and sense of the other, right? And we can learn more of it as clients start to tell us stories about how they engage with others, right? So kind of this internalized object representation of themselves or somebody else. And so Elizabeth Smart, I don't know if you know who she was, but she was kidnapped, right? And kidnapped by this guy who was kind of this religious, fanatical kind of guy, right? And was held for him by a long time, I want to say years, and by his wife. And it actually had a child, like he raped her and had a child, right? Wow. And then, eventually got free. But when she got free, the thing that she said that was so powerful is she said, I survived by telling myself every day, my mother loves me. My mother loves me. And this is a sense of internalized object representation of the other that helped get her through a traumatic situation, right? And so this is what I, talk to my clients about, like, she could look within and say what object relations call the self-soothing object, right? Like she could find comfort in a horrible situation through this, right? For some folk, when they look within, what they have is like a rejecting other, right? Or something like that. So for me, I'm listening in the things that clients share with me about, so what's their object representation of themselves? What's their object representation of others? And how has that come to be, right? Because the cool thing is we can hone them, right? I don't want to, I tell my interns and trainees, we don't want to smash them to pieces, right? Because if not, if you think about it, then when I look within, theoretically, I have nothing, right? So, and wow, what does that do, right? And so I know you go to Regent, so if you think about it, internalized object representation of God, right? So for some people, when they look inside, there's a soothing sense because God is with them, right? Type thing, and they know that, so it helps buffer, right? But or for some people, their object representation of God is going to come from their family system, and they had really abusive parents, and so their object representation of the other, like, why in the world would I want an authority figure in my life who's over everything? Because really they've been hurtful. So why in the world do I want to believe in God, right? Because I know how authority figures work, and I don't want any of that, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes
yeah. So I try to explain it to clients like that, and so then obviously and then attachment theory goes hand in hand, then, right? Because all of that impacts people's attachment styles, right? And the really cool thing about both of them is we can have different attachment styles with different people. We have different object representations of the other, right? Which hone our own object representation of ourselves. And that attachment styles can change over time, right? So even though someone might have an anxious attachment style, as they begin to engage with other folk, and as we begin to challenge some of those beliefs and things or fears, right, and say, and so this is where CBT comes back into the picture, right? So people, they're like, I thought you don't like CBT. I said, well, you always have to do some cognitive behavioral interventions. I mean, you don't, most of the time, I mean, it's just for me, it's like, what takes precedence and what do I believe about how people get stuck and change? And I believe the tenets that, feelings often come out of thoughts and beliefs about things. But there is some research around, and I should have looked this up before, but around, we often think, oh, this experience happens, I have this feeling about it, and therefore, that's how it works, right? Or I have a feeling like ever. But what they found is that actually, there's like separate cataloging of experiences. Makes sense. And I tell clients, and it really resonates for some of my clients. So in other words, I had this experience. Yes, I gave this meaning to it and this feeling came, but actually they're separate things, right? And that I can have an experience and then catalog it in a different way, which will lead to some different things as well, right? And so with attachments, we can kind of begin to challenge that, or like in group, or even in the context of individual therapy, to say, so what does that mean for our relationship? Right. And so for some of my clients, especially at the beginning, especially ones who have like anxious attachment or something, I'll say, if you want, call my phone, leave me a message, like in the middle of the night or something, like, call and leave me a message. If you need me to call you back, tell me that you need me to call you back. But if you don't, just say, I don't need you to call me back. I just wanted to hear your voice. Right. And so, and it's not so much that my voice is soothing, which it's really not, but it's that, okay, I know there's this person, and they can begin to hone that sense of the other, right? That there's somebody who's soothing that I can call upon, and begin to like hone that internalized object representation, right? So it can be different, and I can learn it, and I can attach maybe right here, right? A little bit, and I try to make decisions about if a client runs from treatment, like, okay, am I going to chase or not, right? And that's really based on what I feel about their attachment style, right? And so for some clients, I'm just going to let them run. Go ahead and run. But I do tell my clients, if you run, I do ask that at some point you pause and turn around to look to see if something really scary is chasing you. If it is, then keep running, right? That's smart, right? But if it's not, then maybe, broach coming back, right? Like that. And so kind of giving them space to kind of figure that out for themselves, so, or if someone has an avoidant attachment style, right? And they're just going to get pissed off that you care about them, right? And then their vulnerability gets elicited. So I get that too, right? So you need space. Okay. You can have space, right? Or clients who are angry. I'm not afraid of anger. It makes sense to me why people are angry sometimes, right? I don't always think it's a secondary emotion, right? Like, oh, people got hurt. No, sometimes they're angry because it's a pissy situation and they should be angry, Yeah. And so, allowing them to anger, that's all right, whatever, because we're going to do this attachment dance with the goal of eventually having some healthy attachment, right? And then they can begin to challenge some of their fears and beliefs about attaching to others. So for me, they really work hand in hand because it's dynamic, right? And I believe that all relationships are dynamic. So let me say that too. You can ask people in my agency, they're like, yeah. So even with therapists, right? Like, I think we can co-create difficult clients, right? And so if it's a dynamic relationship, which I believe all relationships are, for me, really, and this is where AADP comes in for me, like, how do I want to work with this defense? And what's a way that's more transformative and gentler than just smashing it, So because I don't think any of us, it might be necessary to smash a defense, but if you think about your own defenses, if you say, hey, you got a choice, Daniel, how would you like your defense to be worked with? I don't think anybody wants their defense to be smashed. So hopefully that makes, I'm trying to speak about it in layman's terms about how I think about the theories of.
Yeah, they're very complicated, and I think you did a good job of breaking them down. So with attachment theory and working with clients, let's say you have someone that comes in with maybe an anxious or avoidant style of attachment, and is maybe the theory or the goal to get them to securely attach to you, and then to generalize that attachment out to other people?
If it's individual therapy, I think that's part of the goal, right? Or if not me, are there people in their world, right, that they're kind of drawn to, right? That we can begin to say, gosh, what would it take to have that next step, right? So, but ideally for some of them, that it's going to happen. Ideally, it's going to happen with me, or at least the process is going to happen with me. In group, that's the luxury of group, right? There's so many different people, and you can kind of see natural subgroups, right, as they're created, and you can use those to really facilitate work. And it doesn't have to be with us. And ideally it's not, right? And if you look at the group literature anyway, it says that really most of the time clients attribute really good interventions to each other and not to us. So I tell people when I teach class, I'm like, if you're one of these people that everybody needs to know it was you who did it, you're going to be disappointed, right? So, but I can, and then we can use this to, like, I call it put group in your pocket or take group with you. And so I can give you an example from our groups. I had a woman who had experienced sexual abuse at the hand of a stepsister, right? And when she was younger, and her father caught her stepsister in the act one day, and he was mortified, right? But the way that my client, our group client, experienced that was it really induced shame for her, right? She saw her father's horror, and rather than being able to say, gosh, this is really about my stepsister, for her, it was she. So she, in some ways, internalized a lot of the shame. And then just, shame that goes oftentimes for survivors of abuse. And so she would often be involved in these relationships, which would just, these that are kind of typical of folks with, like, cluster B diagnoses, right? And so, but in group one time, that she really got really close to another woman in the group. And so we'd eventually gotten to a place in the work where she said, I just have a hard time saying no. So she had difficulty setting boundaries with people. Well, this makes sense, right? You've been abused, your boundaries have been transgressed. Then you engage in these kind of reenactments, right, so to speak, with all these other people, and are heartbroken and all this other kind of stuff. Of course, you don't know how to set boundaries, right? And so, so one of the things she said is, like, can you say no? And she said, I really just don't know how to say no. And I think I believed her, right? She didn't know how to say no. And so we had kind of a natural subgroup, and she was close to another woman in the group. And I said, can you say no for her, right? And so she said no. And I said, is that how it needs to hear? She goes, no, it needs to be stronger, right? And so the two of them in group played with this no.
Wow.
Until the other group member who she was close to said it in such a way, because she trusted her and had this attachment where she could hear it. And so I said, okay, until you can say no for yourself, when you're out in the world, can you hear her saying no for you, right? And so take the group with you. And she could, right? And it was really healing to her. And then, research suggests altruism is therapeutic, right? If we think about the therapeutic factors, it's one of the more therapeutic. And so the other group member then, is helping facilitate healing for someone that she feels close to as well. So we're strengthening that attachment, and also doing that piece of the work, right, which object relation says, I'm going to internalize you, right? So that when I look inside, I've got this thing that's going to help me, it's going to either soothe me or help me function or help me know that boundaries are okay. Right. And then I can set them with folks. So that's how I see it working. Right. So.
Yeah, that That's really neat. This is kind of going out on a limb here. I don't know if you would have quite an answer, but what do you think for someone like her who felt the shame and then but also saw the way her father reacted? And how much of that do you think, that she feels like she has to carry for her father, knowing that her father reacted in such a way? Like, what do you think that does?
Oh, what do I think that? Okay, you asked me multiple questions there. So yeah, I could hear the first part of the question. Like, yeah, maybe I have to carry this for my family, and in some ways, we would listen for that pattern, right? So in some ways, it seems like you carry. Oh, sorry, don't make silences. Seems like you. Sorry, there's a silence. There we go. Yeah, like in some ways, you tend to carry the difficult affect for your family, right? And so what would it look like to give that up, type thing. I think you could go that route with it. Yeah, especially if we're hearing that pattern, or we could say, gosh, it seems to be really painful to have to carry the weighty things for your family, and knowing that, if you think about diversity issues, not so much with this about shame and trauma, but that oftentimes it's hard. Like sometimes I think we don't want to miss the piece about, culturally, there is cost to making a different decision, right? So if I choose not to respond in this way to my family, then maybe I lose the support of my family, right? Or whatever, right? And so trying to gauge those things too, so that, counting the cost. I was talking about this the other night in group. I said, sometimes living out our values means we have to count the cost, right? Because living out our values, we're going to live more congruently, and living congruently helps people feel better. But it doesn't mean that it's without pain or without distress, right? But it does mean in the long run, when you look back, you can say, I've lived a congruent life, right? And so then it needs to be some discussion around lived versus stated values, right? Like what are your real lived? I hear your stated values, red, white, and blue, mom and apple pie, or whatever they are, right? But what are your lived values if you're really honest with yourself, and then, okay, what does that mean, right? And I think sometimes we say we have lived values until we get in distressing situations, and then we go, oh, that's not my value, right? And I'm like, okay, that's fine too. Now and you're being honest. But I think sometimes it's important to talk about the consequences of this. Every choice has consequences. Some of them are more enjoyable than others. So I think in that case, depending on some cultural factors, I might say, gosh, what will this cost, and how do you move forward knowing that, and not saying that it's the wrong or bad decision, but just that this will be part of it as well. So
yeah, good. Thank you. You mentioned AEDP, so accelerated experiential dynamic psychotherapy. And so defenses in this aspect would be, you mentioned, not only how can I get into the client's room, but what do they have that's keeping me from entering? And so can you talk about a little bit about AEDP and Diana Fosha's kind of theory about defenses? And
and probably someone else could do this better than I could, so I'll put that disclaimer on it. But for her, she's got like these triangles of defenses, right? And oftentimes they're also around like red light and green light affects, right? And so kind of looking at what affects, and this is not her language, this is sensory motor language, but what affects are procedurally learned, right? And keep people from getting to more transformational affects, right? And so, and beginning to explore there, but also kind of going at it. The way I describe her, which I mean as a compliment, is almost like slow moving crude oil on a slightly slanted slope, right? Like it's moving, but it's just so slow that if you're not paying attention, right? But I think that's part of her work in terms of working with clients. And so to really address a defense, so she'll look and say, is it a soft defense or a hard defense, right? And if it's a soft defense, then I can proceed, right? And so, and we do that by kind of pressing up against the edges of it and exploring it, right? Or is it a hard defense? And a hard defense, if we press up against the edges, we run the risk of entrenching the defense, right? So kind of looking to say, gosh, what's the function of the defense, right? Because all defenses have functions, right? And then kind of getting them to explore, basically how in my language, how's this working for you, or what's been the cost of this for you, and what would happen if we just just took one little piece away. So to give you an example, like maybe we have a client and, I say, gosh, it seems like when we begin to talk about your shame that you look away, and I'm curious whether you can just look at me for just a second, right? Like what would happen if you just looked for a second, right? And to have them look, right? And hopefully for me to mirror compassion, right? Or empathy, right? And to begin to explore what affects arise there, right? Like that. And some of those are, gratitude or gosh, relief. This person's not shaming me and things like that, because maybe it's a totally different experience from what they've had up to this point, right? And so, and shame makes people want to hide and run, right?
Yeah.
And then to kind of meta process that. So what is it like then knowing that here, what you got was kindness, right? Versus like shame or anger or judgment, like that. But we're very, very slow. And then, and to really process what's going on for them in the room, right? So in the individual session or in the group, within the context of the group. So, but it's really just saying, all right, I don't want to engage the defense in such a way that the client's going to get more entrenched in it. So for example, for me, then what I'm trying to listen for and feel and sense is like, does it feel like it's a power struggle, right? If so, or that we're about to get in this like battle, so to speak, then I'm going to move away from that, right? So, because I don't want to entrench the defense, but I'm going to look for, okay, so what's another avenue? So what other affects can we begin to work with to perhaps bring down the wall, on those affects that keep them stuck, right? Which would be like anger sometimes keeps people stuck. Like I said, for me, it's an assessment of, is this kind of productive anger, or is this like an entrenched defense like that? So anxiety can keep people stuck, all those things.
So perhaps if they seemed angry or avoidant and they looked away in shame, and you said, I wonder what would happen if are you able to look at me for just a split second? And they said like, no, I can't do that. Then that's a pretty strong defense, and you don't want to really.
Yeah. And I think what I would do then, is probably just go, okay, that's okay. It's okay. It's, I'm glad that you just have found the courage to come in here and even share that with me. Right. So I'm going to just leave it there. Yeah. Yeah. I like to do trauma work, and I worked with someone one time who was an international student and had serial abuse at the hands of a parent in their home country, which the other parent did nothing about until they had a conflict with the other parent, and so they tried to bring it up in a case, a court proceeding, and basically the message from the judge was never tell anybody this because it'll ruin your life. And so basically the person didn't get any help. And so came over here and was in a program. I just don't want to reveal it too much because I don't want to bring confidence. Was in a program where, of course, they chose that program given their history, right? And but when they came to see me at the beginning, they said they sat down and I knew why they were coming because they had been referred from their department. And they said to me, they said, "Don't look at me." And I said, okay, well, and if you think about this is your social engagement system, your whole vagus nerve comes through here, right? That we're always going safe, unsafe, safe, unsafe, safe, unsafe, right? Millisecond. I mean, their brain was just sending, and rightfully so, messages of unsafe, 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 unsafe. Their whole world was unsafe. So I get it. So they said, don't look at me. So I said, okay. So I just looked away. And for the first couple of times I tried to look back, and this person would be like, I told you, don't look at me. So I said, so like three tries in the first session, I was like, 3 straight out. So I said, okay, so I have a window. So I just looked out my window, right? For 50 minutes. We did this for three sessions of, they would come in and I'd start and they'd be like, don't look at me. And so finally at the end of the third session, they let me look at them. Right. And so then I tried to invite some curiosity just about their internal experience, but very slow work, right? And not brief work, not solution focused, right? Like we're talking. Somebody asked me the other day, they're like, "What did you think about? Like, were you thinking about them the whole time?" I said, "No, probably not. I mean, because we were just talking about presence." I said, but at some point, I was like, "Okay, well, I need to not look at them because they've asked me not to, and they're setting a boundary, which before they haven't had a right to do so."
Yeah.
So I thought, so like I said, I looked out the window and I was like, yeah. One time I think a helicopter flew by and I'm like, what's the helicopter doing? We're downtown Richmond. I'm like, what's the helicopter doing right there? So, but just that kind of work. Yeah. We're like,
Mm.
I'm not going to, this is a really strong defense. It's there for a reason. The reason makes sense to me.
Uh-huh.
I need to get beyond the defense, but really, well, why would they let it down if, this is the first test and they've said no, and I disregard their no,
Yeah.
so yeah, working like that. So I'm trying to listen and feel the defense, do an intervention, but depending on the strength of the response, that's fine. So I want to talk to them eventually about, and this is ADP, right? Like, what's the nature of the defense? What's the function that it served? Because it served a function, and at some point it was typically a helpful one, right? Because most of the time when people come to therapy, the thing that used to work before, it doesn't work now, and that's why they're coming to see us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so to talk about the function of it, and then to begin to explore what's underneath it, meta process that, and then kind of look forward about, gosh, so part of this was to keep yourself safe, right? Like, I'm curious, what are some other ways? You're in a different place now, environmentally, emotionally, chronologically, right? All those things. And so how can you keep yourself safe now in a way where you didn't, where you couldn't before? It wasn't that you didn't, you just really couldn't. So.
Yeah. Can you talk to us a little bit about cluster B personality disorders? What are they and your interest in them?
Yeah. Probably part of this is, as a social worker, social workers get thrown everything, right? And so in some ways, it's kind of like, you better learn how to work with folks with these diagnoses, right? And so it's more what, traditionally used to be called your personality disorders, right? And traditional thought about it was, by age like 3 or 5, these people kind of have these personality structures, and that's it, and so oftentimes what would happen is someone would come and they would have a personality disorder. And so, the clinician talk about them was not the most positive, right? And I'm not one who's like, oh, we always have to be, sunshine and rainbows about our clients, right? I mean, I think clinicians can have really macabre conversations about stuff, especially depending on the type of work that you do. So I'm not one of these people that's like, oh, but I do think how we think about clients and their presenting concerns impacts how we treat them and how we meta-communicate, which is even more important, right? Because we're always meta-communicating, regardless of whether our lips are moving or not, right? And so how I think about them and how they got to where they are really impacts how I treat them and the interventions I do. So if you think about it, if I said, yeah, you got someone with borderline personality disorder, it's historically the response is going to be different from if I said, you have someone who has a history of extensive trauma with little family support, right? Who's then gone through all these other things. Well, gosh, when I say that, then it tends to elicit empathy from people, right? Yeah. And so this is true for most people who come with a cluster B, some kind of cluster B diagnosis, but it's just reflected in different behaviors, right? So someone might have borderline personality disorder, they're going to split more. So you're all good or you're all bad, which none of us is either of those, right? They're going to have really intense relationships. They're going to love you today and hate you tomorrow, or love you today and hate you 5 minutes from now, type thing. Or if someone comes with more narcissistic personality disorder, right? Like this kind of grandiose self, which is really hiding this shamed self, right? All those kind of things. So it's going to reflect in different ways. And then also there's been more recent research around this that actually for some folks with cluster B diagnosis, their brains are different, right? Like different parts are smaller and things like that. And Fred de Blasio is a social worker up at University of Maryland who talks about trying to work with folks with cluster B diagnoses, especially like borderline personality disorder, as almost like they have a learning disability, right? And so there is going to be a cognitive piece to it. There is going to be a repetitive piece to it for them, but and slow and steady work to begin to change some of those things, right? And so, and then if you look at the group literature, a lot, there'd be this writings about, DBT groups are made for folks with cluster B, right? But you're thinking about more like interpersonal process groups, like it's helpful to have some folks with a personality disorder, but not everybody, right? Because the goal is going to be different. And also they're going to get different feedback about the experience, right? So maybe they experience it and they get activated and they have this kind of labile response, right? And so we can explore the meaning of that for them, but then we can broaden it out to the group and say, well, gosh, Daniel, I'm curious how you experienced it because Kristi got really upset. And then you can reflect back what you saw. And then it gives them an opportunity to see, oh, well, gosh, here's 3 other people. Their responses were different, and to begin to maybe get new sets of eyes, so to speak, and new sets of ways to look at this thing right? And to work on it. I will say the flip side, sometimes it's difficult, right? Because folks with cluster B diagnoses aren't always easy to be around. And so the other piece in terms of the work in group is it's going to elicit stuff for the other folk, but I think that can be rich, because we can still do the work with them if every relationship's dynamic to say, okay, so I'm curious what got pulled for you, because you don't typically talk that way in group to other people, right? And then people, so my client I told you about before, who was really bereft as an infant and stuff like that, was in my group for a while. And I had that client who I told you about, who had experienced the sexual abuse at the hands of her stepsister, just cussed him out one day, right? And she's like, excuse me, like apologized before she did it. And I'm like, whoa. He was thrilled, right? Because that's what he wanted to elicit, right? Like, yeah, this is what people are like. And, and so in some ways, but for her, I said, what happened? I said, because I agree with you. You don't talk to people that way. And she was like, you remind me of my father. Well, here we go. Now we've got the other piece of this, right? And we can do the work for her around that piece, right? But I think a couple of things, like we the leaders, clinicians need to be able to tolerate what gets activated for folk, right? To trust that we have the skills to modulate it. I think an individual, most of the time we feel pretty comfortable doing that, right? Or at least willing to sit with it. But I think in group too, knowing that we, have the ability and the skills to make decisions to help modulate that, or to know that at sometimes we're going to have to be more active, and just to say, I'm going to stop you right now from saying that, and I'm going to tell you why, right? And then if there's any response, it gets, elicited back to me, versus like a group member. So, but for me, I think we all come by our behaviors honestly. That doesn't mean they're helpful. That doesn't mean they're healthy. That doesn't mean they're productive. They can be really hurtful. But we didn't just like one day decide to, whatever, like all of life shapes us. And so for me, it's, coming with that understanding, and that it's very true for folks with cluster B. And then especially if your brain's different, like we don't get all, well, let me back. I was about to say, we don't get all out of whack for people if they have like ADD, but actually sometimes people do, right? And then students come, they're like, oh my gosh, I wish I knew this before, because my parents have just been like, oh, I can't, you complete, blah, blah, blah. They're like, hey, so, but yeah, I think sometimes just some understanding, right, goes a long way towards starting to change some internal structures for folks, and then to help for that part with the brain in terms of like working things differently.
That makes me think that the last part there with object relations theory, if someone comes in and they have this internalized object of, let's say, the judgmental father, right? Is the work to replace that object with a different type of object, or what kind of different objects might there be? And all kinds of
internalized object representations, right? So if we can incorporate some more soothing object representations, I think that's really important, right? And so and like I said, we don't want to smash representation, because if I look inside and I have nothing, where do I turn, right? I mean, think about like if it's just the world were void, right? So and that can be really anxiety provoking. But I do think what we want to do, so if that's an accurate object representation of their father, I think kind of our work is around to acknowledge that and validate that. Yes, and not all people are like that, or not all men are like that, or that I hear that's how you're experiencing, Steve. But I'm curious about if that's really what we've got here, right? So I can give you an example from group. We had groups meet in a circle, right? And clinicians wouldn't know what to do if we didn't sit in circles, right, at places. So we had a group member who used to, when she would come to group, the very first thing she would do was scoot her chair out of the circle, right?
Interesting.
And we had another group member, which was great, because they were the first. I had noticed it, but she was actually the first one to make a process comment. She said, every time you come to group, the very first thing you do is scoot your chair out of the circle. And the woman was like, like she had no conscious awareness of it, right? So we said, well, I wonder if we can explore it. Like, what happens for you? And what she shared was a story of her father practiced martial arts, like had his own dojo and stuff like that. But he would hit them around like the table if he got angry at them, right? And so what she had learned to do over time was to move herself far enough away from him that she was literally beyond arm's reach,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So for her, it was this procedurally learned thing at this point, right? And so part of our work was like, and so we heard that. And so we said, the good news is your father is not here, right? So then we could kind of explore, do you feel unsafe with anybody else in the group, right? And she really couldn't name anybody that she felt unsafe with. So we said, well, wonder if we can do an experiment and wonder if you would move your chair just a little. You don't have to move it all the way into the group. Let's just see what happens. And of course, it would elicit anxiety for her, right?
Yeah.
And so like I said earlier, the way to get over anxiety is through it. So can you just sit moving your chair up this much in the night session, right? And then, at the end, checking back in to be like, so how are you? You made it through a whole 90 minutes, right? Of, and then, oh, I'm safe, right? So then she can begin to change internalized object representations of other, right? That not everybody's here to whack me if they disagree with me, right? And we can begin to change it that way, right? So sometimes the object representation is accurate, right? Like, yes, this person is that, but it's not true of everybody, right? And it's not true of like men or fathers or authority figures. It's true of this one person, or sometimes that's not accurate, right? It's just a compilation of things. So
yeah, that's very interesting. It reminds me, I forget what the logical fallacy is, but basically, I met Steve and he has red hair and he's from Georgia. So all people from Georgia have red hair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Which
is how we think, right?
Yeah.
When I used to teach, I had really, really, really long hair, and our cross-country coach had really, really long hair. Same thing. A kid was like, are you related to Coach so-and-so? I said, no. I said, no. Why would you ask that? And same thing. They're like, you both have really long hair. I said, that's true. We were in no way related. Yeah.
It's so cute to see the way that kids think, but like that's like we just said, that's how we all tend to, like, we all think like that still.
Yeah. We all get stuff, right? I mean, because our brains are meaning making, right? And our brains are lean towards what'll keep me safe, right? And so, yeah, so oftentimes we're going to come up with these attributions that aren't accurate, but we're living at them, so.
Yeah. Any good, or who would you say are maybe some influential authors in your field that you look up to?
Yeah. Well, I like the people who laid the foundations, right? So, so Winnicott, right, and object relations. Scharf and Scharf have written some really good books. They used to be married; they're not now. So, kind of, so some of their books, they're together on the picture, so we're like, oh, feel bad about that, type thing. I would say Bowlby, right, all his volumes on attachment. And matter of fact, my director that I was telling you about at the beginning, who was the co-founder of Vision 49, when he died, his wife, she invited me and another clinician who were really close to him to come to his library and write and say, please take books. He would love for you to have some of his books. And so I took his Bowlby books, right?
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So in terms of my attachment to him as well. So, so I think, Mary Main, an adult attachment inventory. This book that I told you about that's more recent, about group and attachment theory, is a really good book. I'm also into somatic interventions and things like that. So, The Body Remembers, volumes 1 and 2, The Body Keeps the Score, right? So The Body Remembers is Babette Rothschild. The Body Keeps the Score is Bessel van der Kolk. Pat Ogden's book around sensory motor psychotherapy. All the stuff with Stephen Porges and Deb Dana around polyvagal theory, right? Which, so any of their stuff is good. I will say that if you read the original version of polyvagal theory by Steve Danish, he's a researcher and a scientist. It's pretty dense. So I used to our office is, it's a big circle, right? Like, maybe there's offices, but it's a circle. And I used to go to next door and I'd read a paragraph out loud. And people would just look at me like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, me neither, right? So I go to the next office, and kind of by the time I got halfway around the circle, I'd be like, oh, okay. So, but Deb Dana is I believe she's a social worker who actually kind of is like the clinical face of the work they do there. So she translates it. I'm like, all right, that's cool. But the really cool thing about that too is like, so we think about regulation. Like, she made a statement about our nervous system is familiar with all these states, right? So the states of dysregulation, but also calm and kind of ventral vagal states. And I've thought about that because I'm like, I'm not sure it's true for everybody, especially if they have a pretty extensive childhood trauma. But when I say it to clients, they really seem to latch onto them. I'm like, your body knows this somewhere, right? And they're like, yeah, and they begin to explore kind of internal experiences.
Wow.
And be like, yeah, and so they can find it somewhere. And also that tells us what's been internalized as well too, right? It's a physiological thing, but there's also this experience that then gets cataloged and gets internalized. So I think it's really powerful.
That's really neat. I've always been fascinated I've heard stories about people who have migraines that have just always had them, or back pain or whatever it is. And then after psychotherapy, they no longer have that.
I have a trauma certification from Lisa Farron's. I don't know if you heard of her. She's a social worker. She has her own like trauma institute now. She used to do it out of UMBC. And so I took it's like 66 hours. I don't know how many it is now, but it was then. I took it with her when she's back in UMBC. But one of the things that we did was, think about these things like, is there a part of your body that just always hurts, right? Kind of focusing there, kind of, so this directed mindfulness piece, right? And then really speaking to that part of your body and apologizing for, the ways you, whatever. And so I did that, and my lower back tends to be tight. And I was like, whoa, yeah, same thing. I was like, all right. So I was like, okay, I don't get it at this moment, but I get that it feels better. Right. And
wow.
So just kind of thinking about directed mindfulness. I'm not one for big mindfulness. I mean, there's all this research, mindfulness helps. And so I'm not saying that research doesn't help. I'm just saying that for me, and I think for a lot of American, Western Europeans, that, whatever. But directed mindfulness and inviting curiosity about internal experiences versus fear, at least for me and the students I work with, they buy into that, and it makes sense to them. So
yeah, that's really neat. Yeah. Okay, Kristi, this has been very, very just fun and informative, and I've learned a lot. And I thank you.
Hopefully it's helpful. If not, my apologies.
No, it's very helpful. Thank you. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. So.
Thanks for making the time.
All right.
Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.